Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 29 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. 50 years ago, the United States was massively escalating its war in Vietnam. Recently, the Pentagon launched an expensive propaganda campaign to whitewash what really happened and glorify the Vietnam War as a noble effort. Our TV program for this month will counter that with truthful information that the Pentagon does not want you to know. We have two guests, Larry Kirshner and Mark Fleming, who will help us explore the topic. Both of our guests served in the U.S. Army in Vietnam. Both went back to Vietnam recently for peace-related purposes. Both are active with Veterans for Peace and with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. I'm happy to welcome Larry Kirshner and Mark Fleming. Thanks for sharing the information and insights with us during this hour.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Mark, thanks for being a guest. Normally, Mark has been our technical director
This is different.
In the control room, and now you get to be up in front. So thanks for that as well. Mark, can you tell us something about the Pentagon's 50th anniversary commemoration of the Vietnam major escalation?
Sure. This is, I guess, a commemoration that was launched, I think, in 2012.
Yeah.
And yeah, to commemorate the 50th anniversary, and it was based on 1962 to celebrate and to thank Vietnam veterans for their service. Apparently, the biggest problem with Vietnam is we didn't thank veterans for their service. So now we're doing it 50 years later.
That's the Pentagon sense of things.
Yeah, so Barack Obama made a statement talking about the purposes, saying, we're here to honor the service and recognize that what your service was part of a long tradition of service, going back to World War II, of heroic service in U.S. Armed Forces. Uh-huh. And in fact, it really wasn't. Or well, actually, it was kind of within a tradition of American forces being used for very spurious purposes. Uh-huh. And that's not what they're telling us about.
Right. Now, both of you are very active with Veterans for Peace, and you're helping Veterans for Peace with the full disclosure campaign. Tell us about that. Well, tell us first about Veterans for Peace as an organization nationally and locally.
Well, Veterans for Peace is a national organization. There are about 140 chapters around the world, and we're dedicated to having served our country previously, to continuing to serve our country by speaking out against war and seeking to end war as an instrument of national policy, and also to, I guess, make whole the victims of war. There are a few other parts of our mission statement that I can't remember, but that gives you the idea. We've seen the war, we know what it does, we know we don't want to do it again. And then here in Olympia, we have the Rachel Corrie Chapter 109. Larry and I are both members, along with several other number of other veterans, and we're active locally.
And so I want to let people know there's veteransforpeace.org is the national website,
Right.
and www.vfp109rcc.org
Correct.
would be the local website. Now, tell us a bit about the Veterans for Peace Full Disclosure Campaign, Mark.
Well, as you said, as we mentioned, there's this official Pentagon commemoration, and it's pretty narrowly focused on creating this certain image. The Full Disclosure Campaign is actually presenting the other side. The Pentagon says it was heroic, it was part of a national effort, and American servicemen, did everything they needed to be done. On the other side, Full Disclosure looks at what the war as a whole, because the official commemoration is America-centric. Full Disclosure speaks to all the war, and that's Americans and Vietnamese. And one of the biggest problems in this commemoration is it doesn't really recognize the Vietnamese, and it also basically writes away the anti-war movement. That's something we're supposed to forget. In fact, if anything, we're supposed to remember that they're the ones that caused us to lose. That's part of the demonization, and they're carrying that on. So Full Disclosure talks about that, and it puts the war in the context of both a long series of policy that we'll talk about, as well as this rising opposition. And I have one article to show, and for those who are very interested in getting much more information, VFP has just put out an issue. It's called Peace in Our Times and Full Disclosure. It is very comprehensive. It includes both American and Vietnamese voices. And it talks about how Americans did oppose the war and how the Vietnamese responded to that. There's also a series of photographs in here that just prove that America could never win.
And we'll also cover later in the program some of that kind of information, including the GI resistance that was very significant.
Yeah, the Pentagon is spending $65 million over a 12 or 15-year period to promote this commemoration of the war. And the way they're whitewashing the Vietnam War and all the implications of the Vietnam War, they're using it as a platform to justify further wars. They're trying to show that everything that America has done is a noble and heroic thing. America is always right. So that means that the current wars that we're involved in, they're also right too, because they're in that long tradition.
Right.
And the Veterans for Peace movement is trying to at least bring the truth out to people, so you have at least a different point of view when you look at this.
We want to take a look at the historical roots to this, because the Vietnam War did not just start in the 60s. Most people in this country were not paying attention until it really hit in the mid-60s. But I'd like, Larry, if you could bring us some historical background going back to the late 1800s, even with the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, if you look at America from the beginning, they started the 13 colonies and then spread out across North America. And when they reached the Pacific Rim in the mid-1800s, then where do you go from here? And we saw China in particular as a good market for all of our goods and services. And so the American empire spread what today's being called the pivot to the Pacific, spread throughout the Pacific region. And part of what happened in the 1890s was there was a coup in Hawaii that we supported and helped along. And then
so that was overthrowing their indigenous
their popular monarch who was a legal representative of the Hawaiian people. And then we got involved with trying to overthrow the last vestiges of the Spanish Empire. And during the course of that Spanish-American War, 1890, we took Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And then because the Philippine people had already had revolutionary groups opposing the Spanish, when the Americans came, they didn't see the Americans as any better masters than the Spanish, so they continued to oppose, and America became involved in the first Asian War of that time, just after the turn of the century. And then we subsequently became involved in the Second World War against the Japanese, and then the war in Korea against the Koreans and the Chinese, and then the war in Vietnam. So we had 4 major Asian wars that people don't think about.
Right. Yeah. There's a sequence there that's
Right.
important. Let's look at the World War II example. What was going on during World War II relative to Vietnam?
Well, actually, during World War II, Japan had invaded Vietnam, and there was a resistance. And Ho Chi Minh and his people were the resistance, and we supported them.
So they were trying to get freedom from the Japanese
Right.
occupation.
And
They were the Viet Minh.
Right, and these were long-time Vietnamese nationalists. Ho Chi Minh had gone to Versailles after World War I seeking freedom for all colonies, and particularly Vietnam. Woodrow Wilson had talked about that as part of his 14 freedoms, and didn't get a hearing. So fast forward 30 years, and fighting the Japanese, we're happy to support him because he's fighting the Japanese. He's tying down troops. And he had a very effective fighting force. He worked with our Office of Strategic Services. He had American advisors with him at times. So there was a lot of activity, or cooperation between America and Ho Chi Minh at that point. And after the war, when the French had been run out of Vietnam, he declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and we opposed that. And when he made that declaration, an American general was standing behind him. American supporters, the ones he had worked with. And he expected America to support him.
Yeah.
And he even quoted our Declaration of Independence.
Now Vietnam had been a French colony
Right.
before the Japanese took it over during World War II.
And after the Japanese took over, well, it was called French Indochina at the time. It was Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were kind of all seen as one. But Vietnam in particular, when the Japanese took over, the French, if you recall during the Second World War, the French, Vichy French in France was a government that worked with the Germans. So the French government in Vietnam collaborated with the Japanese after the Japanese came in, and the Viet Minh had been fighting the French, and then they continued to fight the French and the Japanese, and that's when the Americans got involved. Okay, so then after the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh, like Mark says, expected that we would agree that they needed independence. But what was going on at the time in Europe was that the military expected there to be a war in Europe with the Soviets coming across Germany. And so all of our focus was on that area, and we wanted France to be part of NATO and be part of that military. So instead of supporting the Vietnamese, we agreed that France should have their colony back in Southeast Asia. So we upset that.
Actually, I can add, American troop transports brought the French troops back to Vietnam.
Right.
And the American sailors, the merchant mariners on those ships, were actually staged the first resistance because they signed a petition saying they thought this was unjust to be bringing the French colonials back.
Yeah,
So that was the first action against Vietnam.
Yeah, way back then. And our American consciousness of our history is that we're always on the side of freedom. But we're on the side of the colonial empires of France and other places too.
That's because they were communists on the other side.
Well, but primarily nationalists.
Yeah.
They were mostly wanting to get independence.
But it made a better story for our aggression if they were the red scourge of communism.
Yeah, you remember the maps for that area showing this red menace coming.
Yeah.
And that's really, I guess, the genesis of how we ended up losing so badly in Vietnam is we saw it through our own lens. We did not see it as it was. We saw it only in the context of American ideology, American interests.
Yeah, and as we'll say later on during this conversation, that's what we do in these other places in Afghanistan and Iraq is we see things from our side and from our government side. We never see things from what ordinary people in Afghanistan or ordinary people in Iraq or Yemen or Somalia, any of those places, what they want.
The idea of local autonomy and being able to make their own decisions doesn't fit into our worldview.
So after, well, so the United States had helped put the French
Back in
back
charge.
in control of this former colony that wanted to be free. And I remember learning decades ago, back around 1970-ish, that when the French lost at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam in 1954, the United States was already paying 80% of the
Exactly
French
right.
cost of their war to keep their colony.
And in
so we
fact-
were heavily involved
Right.
back into the.
There was some discussion of us giving them a nuclear weapon to use at that time too.
So what happened then? When the French lost at Dien Bien Phu, we had the Geneva Accords that made the settlement. It says, okay, the troops from the northern part that are in the south, you withdraw beyond this line, and the southern troops beyond in the north withdraw by that line, the same line. But the Geneva Accords from 1954 explicitly said that this is not to be construed as a national boundary. This is just a line to draw the troops back from.
Right.
It was not to be permanent. There was going to be a reconciliation election in 1956. The United States didn't sign those accords. We acknowledged that they existed, but we did not sign the accord. And that's what Eisenhower used later as part of his rationale to not have the election.
Yeah.
Was
But
that
we also encouraged one of the signers, the South Vietnamese factions, to continue to resist.
Right, yeah. So again, not only were we not on the side of independence movement for a colony, but we were also not supporting the democracy
Right.
of the election. We have stopped that.
And Ho Chi Minh felt that he was being not taken seriously enough by the U.S. and the other powers, because he felt that given a very short period of time, they would have totally won the war. They would have physically driven the French out.
Yeah.
But he was willing to wait the 2 years because he figured in an election there was no doubt he would be elected. So he thought that would be a temporizing move to save lives, and he trusted that the U.S. would and the Western powers would go along with what they said.
Yeah, I think it's important for the viewers to know that Ho Chi Minh, early on, like you said, at the time of the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I, and then now at this stage, Ho Chi Minh was trusting that the United States would act on behalf of democracy and freedom.
He took us at our word.
And yeah, he took us at our word, and he was he wanted to be an ally with the United States in supporting freedom, and the United States rebuffed him, and it's only then when he really said, well, screw you, I'm going to join the other side because we've got to be independent from this colonial master.
I mean, he was Vietnamese first.
Yeah, he was kind of like the George Washington
Yeah.
of their country, and the United States never understood that.
No.
So hardly any Americans paid attention to Vietnam until the mid-'60s, when the war was really vibrantly underway. A lot of the stuff that Americans knew was actually not even true. And I wonder what, Larry, if you could tell us some of the things that we should really know about in the realities while the Vietnam War was underway in the 60s. What was, in contrast with what we were being told, what was really happening in the mid-'60s?
We were being told that we were winning the war and there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that we initially went with advisors, and those advisors had bases, and their function initially was to help support the South Vietnamese government as it developed a government and created a nation, basically, and created an army so they could fight for themselves. But there were a number of instances, like there was a battle at a place called An Bac, where there were 300 Viet Cong were found in a bunker situation. They were surrounded by 1,500 South Vietnamese ARVN military.
Yeah, ARVN be the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South
Exactly.
Vietnamese Army.
And the 300 beat the 500 from the South because the South the South Vietnamese military was as corrupt as the South Vietnamese government. Everybody who was the leaders were spending their time trying to gain political power, and they didn't spend any time training the troops or making the troops effective fighting force. So we had these bases there, and General Westmoreland wanted troops to protect our bases. So that the initial large contingent of Marines that came in '65, they were supposed to be there just to protect the bases in Da Nang, but it just slowly escalated. One thing led to another. Some of the U.S. soldiers at that time, instead of calling him General Westmoreland, they called him General Waste More Men. And so it was just one thing after another, where we concluded that the South Vietnamese fighting force were not going to be effective enough to do what the supposed overall goal was, which is to create a stable government.
You have your own story of being injured that might be good to mention briefly in this context. In
terms of the Viet Cong, basically, and the NVA. Some places it was both.
The North Vietnamese Army.
Right, and
as
some
NVA.
places it was both, and some places it was just one. But we went out on a patrol. I was in an armored personnel carrier group at the time, and we were driving up a trail, and there was a post in the middle of the trail with a sign in Vietnamese saying, "Americans, don't come up here. This territory belongs to us." So, but you know, we're the Americans. We're the good guys. So, of course, we went up and we got ambushed, and 65 out of our company were injured in that ambush, and I got injured that day too. But it was a lot of the hubris of Americans expecting that we're all John Wayne and we're going to win at the end.
Right.
So,
Mark? I'd say one other thing that we were told is that this was a nation fighting for its freedom. South Vietnam was fighting from foreign aggression, and it was communist-led, and that Ngo Dinh Diem, the president, was a South Vietnamese patriot who was fighting for his country, when in fact he led a clique of freebooters. They were very corrupt, as Larry said. Pay didn't get down to the army. They didn't really build a nation. They were largely in it for themselves. And that's one reason why they had an army that wouldn't fight.
Yeah.
And they were actually, that group that was leading the government was largely a Catholic group, which is one of the reasons that John Kennedy, early on in his support of the Vietnamese, because it was a Catholic movement there, but in fact 80% of Vietnam were Buddhists.
Right.
And then in early 1963, Diem, I don't know the reason, but he decided to start cracking down on the Buddhists. And that's when the Buddhists started lighting themselves on fire, and it just totally
Americans
changed
couldn't
the
quite understand that.
impression.
To go after the vast majority of a country, that's pretty bad politics. And just the context of that, the Catholics there were because of the French, France was largely a Catholic country leading up to that during the colonial era, and so the Catholic South Vietnamese leaders were sort of the elite who were affiliated with the French colonial masters.
Right, they were the collaborators early on.
So they were already on the wrong side of the vast majority of the population, just because, not only because of religion, but because of their political elitism.
Right. But for some reason, we thought if we would put him in, there would somehow magically, it was like I was talking with Mark earlier, the United States always tends to see things in a military light, instead of realizing that most of the situations we deal with are political. They're not military. And that was a political situation in Vietnam. It wasn't a military situation.
Yeah, political in terms of not just like a partisanship, but in terms of what's the reality of the people.
Exactly.
Where's the public at? What does the public want? What do the public care about? And it's like, no, we don't care about that. It's all top down.
It's all about real politics.
Yeah, and there's another aspect to this I want to touch on briefly before we move on, and that's racial bias, which has been endemic in this country, not only leading up to the mid-'60s, but in the 50 years since, played out in Vietnam. And I wonder if either of you could say something about just what happened with relative to race.
Are you talking about in the U.S. military or
yeah,
the
US,
Vietnamese culture?
the U.S. military, racial biases in the U.S. military or racial factors.
I mean, there was conflict within the military between black and white soldiers, and there's also racial conflict, or just how we saw the Vietnamese. And we saw them as less than human.
Right.
So they were these.
But there also was a secondary racism in that the Vietnamese saw the Montagnards as even less subhuman
Yeah.
from them. And the Montagnards were a tribal people up in the Central Highlands who hundreds of years ago were a fishing people. And as the Chinese moved down into this area and became Vietnamese, they pushed the Montagnards up into the mountain and they became second-class citizens in their country. In fact, they still are second-class citizens in their country.
But the within the U.S. military, one of you had told me on the phone when we were preparing for this that, and I knew this from before, that the worst assignments were given to the black guys
that's what
and the
appeared to me.
Latinos.
That's what it appeared to me.
I think it's pretty widely known, was widely reported at the time.
Yeah, I think I think it was over 25% of the infantry were black.
Yeah, especially in the earlier years.
And the population as a whole is anywhere near that, or it wasn't.
Mark, can you tell us about some of the lies, the deception, the propaganda? And we've touched on some of this. When we were preparing for this interview and we were on the phone talking, you said something you had already mentioned now a few minutes ago about how we never understood the Vietnamese people. We only saw things from the U.S. government's perspective. Is there anything else to say about the realities or the lies and the deception?
Well, certainly some of the outright lies. The classic one is the Gulf of Tonkin, when we were attacked, and it was used as the basis for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to give Lyndon Johnson war powers. And it turns out that it really wasn't an attack. It turns out that we'd actually been running intelligence missions up along the North Vietnamese coast, and yeah, they may have actually brought patrol boats out because we were doing, I guess, close-in actions.
Yeah.
But in terms of an actual attack, it's been shown that it never happened. But it doesn't make any difference because Johnson got his resolution and got the war.
Yeah.
And then, as Larry said, we were always told that we're always winning. In fact, we were told that we were winning pretty much up until the day they got off the roof in Saigon. And then we saw in the Pentagon papers that they knew early on this isn't going right, and they covered it up.
Yeah, the Pentagon Papers was, for those that don't remember that era, there's a compilation of government documents that proved, it was documentation of their lies.
That they knew.
The government's lies.
Yeah.
They knew, but they, like I said, they were covering it up, and they lied to us repeatedly. I remember when Johnson was running for election in '64, which was
as a peace
before
candidate.
that. He was the peace candidate because Barry Goldwater, the Republican, was a hawk, and Johnson ran saying, I will not send American boys to Vietnam to do a job that the Vietnamese boys ought to be doing. And that was his campaign platform. Meanwhile, the documentation shows he was planning the escalation all along. And the Pentagon Papers were just full of the documentation of the actual lies.
Actually, one other lie that came out of that was the drug war, where Nixon, it was seen on the tapes, where they couldn't criminalize anti-war dissent, they couldn't criminalize blacks, but they could turn it into a drug war and go after them that way.
Right.
And that was part of the way they demonized the anti-war movement.
Yeah, even though the CIA was a major drug runner out of that area. I have a newspaper article at home that I did not bring with me for this conversation, but from an investigative reporter in about 1969 or 70, back when they used to have investigative reporters. And he had clear documentation from back then about the CIA running heroin out of Southeast Asia.
And it was so readily available to everyone. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine that somewhere along the line there wasn't somebody from America involved.
Yeah, and it was quite well documented that the CIA was doing that. At this point, we've laid out some factual stuff. I want to give the viewers a chance to feel things from the standpoint of poetry that each of you has written. Larry, I wonder if you could read a poem. I know you've done several on other programs. This is one you've not done on our program. And then we'll have Mark read a poem that he wrote.
Yeah, the genesis of this poem is the idea that there are things that happened then that, you know, when you come, that you have blocked off from your memory. And there were a lot of things that I didn't really recall until I started meeting with veterans years later and talking about, and things opened. And there was one guy in particular who I was very much friends with in Vietnam, but I didn't remember him. In fact, he sent me a picture and I still couldn't remember who he was. But driving, I remember to note sights which would be good for an ambush. Walking, I watch the ground for dirt which may have been recently disturbed in the laying of mines. Over 40 years later, I still expect the bullet to hit that spot just below my left scapula that always itches like a target. Over 40 years later, I remember when we were boy warriors thrown together far from home. Gun smoke thick as fog, hot brass litter, the lamb-like smell of napalm, burnt indigenous personnel, pile of bodies, slowly moving limbs in rigor, green thick Vietnamese jungle vines, sticky red clay mud in monsoon season. If he wasn't part of that piece of me that couldn't come home, maybe I could remember my friend's face 40 years later.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's important. And Mark, tell us about this poem that you wrote, and tell us what the context was.
Yeah, the context, the context of this is if someone was wounded and the terrain was really rugged, they wouldn't land a helicopter. They'd winch them up on a cable. And if the wound wasn't really severe, they would go up on basically a chair-like thing, that kind of just hugging onto it, being hoisted up. And this is a story about that. I never really knew him, but he has been my companion for many years. Someone said he was a jerk. I can't say. All I know is that the brief time we were together left a lasting impression. You see, I saw him die. His death was not dramatic or heroic, just dumb. An accident in a war filled with many accidents. The difference was that I saw it happen. I saw him die. He fell out of a helicopter that was his ticket to safety. A medical evacuation for a minor cut. Hardly even a wound. A convenient excuse to get out of the jungle. But nobody expected him to die. We watched him rising toward the chopper, envying him his good fortune, each of us wishing that we were ascending in his place. The chopper's big rotors slapped the air as it hovered above the mountainside, its turbines screaming, waiting to carry him back to safety. I saw the medic lean out of the door, reaching to pull him in. I saw him put his feet on the skids, and I saw him fall away from the chopper. He fell abruptly, violently. No slow motion effect, no eternity to reach the ground, just a rapid free fall and a bone-crunching thud. Mere seconds ended his life at 19. His buddies wrapped him in a poncho and hooked him to the cable again. This time he made it, boots pointing upward as they disappeared into the open door. But this time was too late. The chopper carried away a corpse, leaving us to our thoughts, black and evil. No one wanted to trade places with him now. All these years I've remembered his fall and seen his body break upon that mountain. All these years his death has been my companion. I did not know him well, but he remains with me still. Even now, all I really know is that I saw him die. That seems to be more than enough.
Thank you, Mark. The experiences of so many of the U.S. troops there caused a lot of them to feel alienated from the mission, alienated from the war effort, and some turned to substance abuse of various kinds. Can you say something of that, Larry?
I'm not sure about Mark's company, but the group that I was in, pretty much 95% of the people self-medicated in some form or fashion. Maybe 10 or 15% were drunk a good part of the time, and the rest of us smoked dope. occasionally we would get opium, and the place to buy the opium was at the house of the governor of the province that we were fighting in.
The South Vietnamese.
Right, South Vietnamese politician.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you look at other wars, Second World War and I think the Korean War, the U.S. government would send bunches of people who had trained together, who were friends, who knew each other. In the Vietnam War, because they were trying a number of different things to limit casualties, and for some reason they decided that instead of doing unit movements, they would send people one at a time. So you'd be the new guy, and you'd go out to a unit who were full of people who had been there for a period of time, who had been fighting and knew what the war was about, and they saw you as somebody who was likely to get somebody killed because you didn't know what you were doing.
Yeah. Well, the most dangerous times, I understand, are when you're very fresh there, and the last bit of time before you go home, when you start to get careless.
When you're short time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so that kind of that created soldiers who were basically wanted to protect themselves, as their survival was the main reason.
Yeah.
So group unit cohesion and morale tended to be low because of that. So.
And it was kind of ad hoc. I mean, you come in and you'd sort of bond with a group, and as you proved yourself, you kind of felt in, kind of moved in, felt a little more secure. But it was always like, I need to stay up with these guys. I need to make sure I can do whatever I need to do to keep them alive, because that will keep me alive.
Right.
And I'd also, Larry's description about self-medicating is very true, because we smoked a lot of weed on the fire bases. We never smoked in the field, but coming back into a base, a lot of amount. We also had heroin, which in 1971 became a big problem because it was fine. It was very good heroin, and you could smoke it. You didn't shoot it, so people, I'm not shooting it up. And it also had no odor, so you could smoke it anywhere. And it was just as addictive, in fact, maybe even more so. And this was the army that's described as broken, dispirited, mutinous. In fact, that was the night units refused to go out. That was when fragging, assassinations of officers and NCOs became prominent. So by 1971, when I was there, the war was ending. Nobody really had a sense that there was anything to be accomplished other than getting through 365 days and getting out.
Yeah. And so there was a lot of resistance beyond the alienation and the substance abuse. There was a lot of just overt resistance. And you mentioned fragging, where people, if you have a gung-ho lieutenant that's putting you in danger, he's likely to get shot in the back by his own troops. And there's a lot of that. Can you mention something of the other kinds of resistance?
Yeah, well, certainly among black troops, many of them just refused to go out, simply because it wasn't their war. These were white men giving us these orders, and we had no part in it. And that created quite the racial divide. So that was one level of resistance. White guys didn't resist as overtly. A few did. You had some desertions. Most of us just kept low. We did what we had to do just to keep things from going. We call it, instead of search and destroy, it was search and evade.
Right.
We'd go out. We wouldn't look for a fight.
Right. Go out of your way to not fight. They had this thing when I was there. They would bring a sergeant, in from the field and take a bunch of what we called clerks and jerks, the base camp commandos. You'd take them out on a patrol. And this was on Dragon Mountain near Pleiku, where the 4th Division was. So you'd get maybe 15 or 20 of these guys who had no idea what they were doing, and you're supposed to take them out on a patrol so that they could qualify for a combat infantry badge. So there was no way that I was going to go out there with all these people and take the chance of getting shot. Yeah. So they dropped us off, and we went and set up under a big tree for 3 days. And the way they told where you were was they would shoot a flare here and a flare here, and then you'd give them the compass reading, and where they backtrack, they could tell that's where you were. So it wasn't too hard to figure out what to tell them where they thought you were. So we sat under a tree for 3 days And other people did that too. There was no sense
We would do
going
the
out
same
and-
thing with ambush patrols. They'd send out 3 ambush patrols. We'd all just meet in one place and work all 3 radios if we're in 3 different places.
Yeah, I had a friend, when I was in college, I had a friend who had just come back from the Navy. He was on a ship. It was an aircraft carrier, and the pilots would come back after making a bombing run and come back to the aircraft carrier, and they were supposed to be able to tell my friend Paul how many people they had killed. And from the airplane, you don't know. But Paul knew that the higher up officers wanted big numbers. So the pilots came back and they gave some inflated numbers, and Paul would total them up and he'd embellish it, add numbers to that, and that's what got reported. And so I remember there were news reports that were coming in toward the end of the war where we had killed more than the total number of Viet Cong, and yet we were still losing the war.
Right, but it was those numbers that they held up to show that we were winning.
Yeah,
the
so
war.
that was the propaganda, and everybody knew that was a lie.
Our colonel was quite frustrated because it seemed like whenever we made contact, we didn't kill anyone. And he just put a sign up in front of the mess hall, so, we had this contact, 0, this
Yeah.
0. And they said 1 13-cent bullet should be a 13-cent kill.
Yeah.
It was pretty sick.
So there was actually a lot of resistance in the military, and of course the peace movement. And there are people locally did some things. I want to just show a quick. I brought more things here than we have time to show, but this was a poster from the People's Blockade. This was based in Seattle.
The first Chi activists.
Pardon me?
The first Chi activists.
Oh yes, it actually was. Yeah, a large portion of the ammunition going to Vietnam was coming out of the Navy base at Bangor, which is now the Trident submarine base, nuclear weapons. But at that time, the railroad line that went into the Navy base at Bangor was carrying huge amounts of freight trains carrying ammunition. And people would camp out on a hillside and watch these freighters be loaded. And when it looked like the freighter was done being loaded, they'd go out in Hood Canal and put their boats in the way and not let the ship out. And this was the People's Blockades. This poster I got in 1972. It's been on my wall ever since then. Different walls at home, but always up on a wall at home, except for this hour here. And I've got another one, another photo of one where on the hull of the ship, people had started to paint the Seattle phone number of the People's Blockade office. It was 206, and they got the first couple digits of the prefix out before they got busted.
There was some real sabotage done, especially in the Navy. I think it was the Constellation was in San Diego for some repair and maintenance, and somebody dropped a big chain down into the shaft of the engine, and it kept the Constellation there for another 6 months being refurbished. And the Ranger, which was in the area between Vietnam and the Philippines, was supposed to be trading service, but because the Constellation didn't come, the Ranger had to stay there longer, and that caused a lot of mutiny, almost mutiny on the Ranger.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of stuff going on in the Navy.
And there also were a number of people who refused to go with the Constellation again when it was going to be leaving. There were 9 guys. They were the Constellation 9, the Connie 9.
In fact, I think they had a public election in San Diego where the people voted whether the Constellation should go or not.
And none of this gets reported very adequately in the mainstream press, but within the peace movement, at least, in the alternative press.
And that's part of
people-
what full disclosure
people do.
is about, is to bring all this out to people.
Yeah, and we're happy to do this during this hour here. After the war, we were just supposed to forget all that stuff, put it behind us, and of course, I was active in the peace movement, by the late '60s, and we in the '73. I don't have time to show, but I wrote a letter to the editor in '73, right after the Paris Accords were signed, supposedly ending the Vietnam War, and the United States was already violating the agreement there, and this was back in '73. The more that the people in this country learned about the realities there, and not just in Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia, and the massive violence against the people and their environment, the more public opinion turned against militarism overall. And sometimes this aversion to war was referred to as the Vietnam syndrome. But the military hawks in the U.S. wanted to get over that and get on with business as usual in the empire. Can you tell us something about the follow-up? Larry, can you give us
like you say, the career officers wanted to somehow overcome that because technically the United States didn't lose the war in Vietnam, but they didn't win it either. But it was viewed as a defeat by most of the world, and so the U.S. military and the government started coming up with reasons why we lost the war.
Yeah.
And part of it had to do with the media. The media was causing all this trouble and making people.
Story.
And and the Pinko students who were too lazy and cowards, they were one of the reasons we lost. They never discussed the fact that the morale of the U.S. troops had reached such a low point that there were units that weren't issued guns, that their officers were afraid of being shot. Whole companies refused to go out. They didn't discuss the fact that the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were world-class warriors who were fighting to protect their own homeland. None of that was discussed.
Well, right. I mean, that was their own land they were protecting. It's like you think back to the Revolutionary War in the United States, where we had ordinary people in the 13 colonies, and they'd hide behind the tree and shoot the redcoats.
Right.
Redcoats were not really invested in occupying these colonies, but the colonists, the people who lived here, were very determined to protect their homes, their communities.
And one of the
so they were motivated.
Yeah. One of the big insights I had was I realized I was fighting a war in somebody's yard.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
This is their home.
Yeah, and so the thing was never winnable, and when people said, oh, we should have just bombed them more, it's like, we never had, the United States government never had an exit strategy.
Exactly. Yeah. And they discussed, Johnson and McNamara and those folks, they discussed bombing, but that was going to lead to China coming back into the war, and suddenly you have a world war going again, and Vietnam wasn't worth it.
And this also ties into the idea that America tends to see things in terms of military solution. Yeah. So we wanted, suddenly Americans didn't like military solutions, weren't willing to see their sons coming back in boxes. So how do you the elites want to say, well, how can we do this? Well, one thing is to have a professional army that's not tied to a draft.
Right.
And other thing is to find different ways of presenting it. And that's what they've done. And also make them forget about this other war, the one that didn't go so well.
And attacked small countries where we can easily win and show how,
well, at least until,
the army in Grenada was smaller than the police department in Providence, Rhode Island. And yet this was a great victory for us. And
then, we sure kicked butt there, didn't we?
And then we went into Panama, supposedly to arrest Noriega. We killed 3,000 Panamanians, but this was a great victory for the U.S. military. And in fact, I think Papa Bush at that time said, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome.
Yeah, and of course, Noriega was our guy. He was our CIA guy. He was the CIA's drug running guy.
He met with Bush in the White House.
He was, he was our ally, and then we had to turn against him because
turned out he had his own agenda, and we didn't like that.
He didn't want to do what he was told.
He wouldn't take orders from the White House again. And then, so Vietnam was this poor nation that we could not defeat. We could not defeat Afghanistan, one of the poorest nations on earth. I mean, it's like there's something just fundamentally wrong with this.
I think one of the things about Iraq and the current wars is that in Vietnam we hadn't done this. At least most Americans hadn't had the experience or hadn't been told the history of previous occupations. But a lot of us had seen Vietnam. A lot of people had seen what had happened. Yeah. And yet, with that experience, we went in like it had never happened.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the lessons that we didn't learn. That's what full disclosure is trying to bring out.
Yeah, and let's talk about full disclosure. Let's tell us something about the Full Disclosure Campaign. You showed us that publication that looks good, and they have their website, www.vietnamfulldisclosure.org, and there'd be probably links to it from the regular veteransforpeace.org.
So if you go to the Full Disclosure website, what you're going to find are events that are going on around the country. Different chapters are sponsoring teach-ins. We did one here at the Evergreen State College last fall.
It was end of October of 2015, yeah.
We're considering doing another one again this year. Other chapters have done that. So you have that. There's also a blog and articles written by any number of Christian Appy, Andrew Basevich, people who are very familiar with American policy and presenting the side that the commemoration is not. I think they said the commemoration is really a whitewash. And it's this idea that, well, we were so bad to our troops. That was really the worst thing that happened in Vietnam. We were terrible to our troops, and it was some kind of tragedy for America. You know, anybody who's been to Vietnam and talked to Vietnamese, anybody who's gone to any of the hospitals that treat Agent Orange victims, any of the people who've seen any of the lands that were poisoned by Americans, know that treating our soldiers poorly, which we did, is not the greatest tragedy.
Well, go ahead.
And I say, and the tragedy, treating the soldiers poorly was just, we were ignored. I mean, I wasn't spit on. I wasn't harassed.
That spit on thing,
never happened.
That never really
it's
happened.
A
it was fabricated. A history professor in Ohio researched that, tried to track that down, and it was basically propaganda that was made up in order to discredit the peace movement. And meanwhile, folks like you guys were being told, now, thank you for your service. I know you have a good response to that, Mark.
My service. What service to my country? My service to my country is what I'm doing now. My service is valued because I'm a veteran. I can speak out. I earned a voice to speak, and I'm using it.
Yeah, and you're working for peace, which is the meaningful service.
I've debated the whole issue about, how did I go to a war that I knew was wrong? Well, I can't change that, but I can use the voice that I earned to speak. And that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, good.
That gives meaning to it.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would hope comes out of this hour-long conversation is that people would question the very notion of having military violence as a solution to the world's problems.
Yeah.
Violence makes problems worse. Violence does not solve problems. If you look, like you said, if we look at things from a Vietnamese people's perspective, or if we look at things from the perspective of people in Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or Libya or any of these other places, violence is not doing them any favor at all. And violence just makes things worse. And so I'm hoping that people will debunk the notion of military solutions.
Well, think about what was so horrible, existentially dangerous to the United States that we had to go and inflict this kind of damage on an agricultural society.
Yeah.
I mean,
and again, a very, very poor nation that was no threat to us at all. Domino theory was all propaganda and so forth. I wrote a thing that's a pretty substantive 5-page article debunking the notion that militarism could be valid as a way to solve problems. It's on the issues page of the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation's website. So visit www.olympiafor.org, click the issues page, and look for the link to read "The U.S.'s Violent Foreign Policy Makes Problems Worse." And it's a good substantive thing that just walks you right through that. I'm hoping people will check that out, and we'll post that a link to it on the TV program as part of our website as well. So we're rapidly running out of time. Can I get a closing thought from each of you, and then we'll wrap this thing up?
Well, I think one thing people should do is educate themselves as best they can about what actually happened, and then go to the Pentagon's website, and in their search engine put in Kent State, put in peace activists, put in Buddhist self-immolation, put in any of those kinds of things that happened. You won't find any of it on the Pentagon website. So it just shows that this is another attempt by the militarists who control this country to show violence as a noble cause, and that it is noble to die for your country and put yourself at risk. And it's all nonsense and propaganda.
Yeah.
So basically people need to spend some time educating themselves and don't believe what they see on the tube or what the government says.
Great, thank you, Larry. Mark?
And I would second that. In fact, now we have so much information available to us. You can find a lot of this stuff, whereas 20 years ago, you'd have to do a lot of physical work to get this information, so you can find that. And I think beyond that is that you don't, be skeptical. When somebody says war, they're saying, we need to go out and kill people. And people have to say, well, why? What is it about this situation that requires us to go kill them? I mean, killing is a pretty drastic act.
Well, they find all kinds of euphemisms to get around. They say the use of force.
Yeah, well,
When I think of force, I think of you got a pickle jar lid that's really hard. You got to really put some muscle on that pickle jar lid. And that's force. But this is killing.
That's right, and that's what we're trained to do. We were infantry. We are killed to kill and break things and destroy things.
I always said the worst thing about my time in Vietnam was our society took me as a young person, put me in a situation where I had to kill or be killed in order to survive. And then I came back and they told me it was good.
Yeah.
That was the most horrendous thing.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being guests.
Well, thanks for having us.
There's this famous saying that says that people who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and that certainly is the case with what we've been doing in Vietnam and half a century since then. We keep disabling and killing our young people for stupid reasons. We keep wasting our tax dollars for stupid reasons. And then we say we can't afford to take care of education or health or the environment. We need to see reality, see things from other people's point of view. We need to see that violence does not solve problems, it only makes problems worse. Our government has trapped itself in a real death spiral, and the only remedy is for ordinary people to reject war and work for peace, as you folks are doing. You can get information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093, www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family. We can create a better world here on this planet, but the world needs what you have to offer. So thanks for doing everything you possibly can.